name is Nibutulet, chairing today's session. This is a series that's been going on for over 10 years and has dealt with some of the biggest questions that we're facing in our society, particularly the fourth polycrisis of capitalism and its conjunctural moment, which this series has framed the thinking around how we deal and grapple with this conjunctural moment. Today, we are joined by three speakers who have each contributed to today's volume. I'd also like to let you know that this series and this launch will be hosted on the COPAC YouTube page and the EFS webpage, so you can share this after it has concluded. We've also had over 124 people register for this, so some will be joining us live and others will also be joining to watch the recording once it has finished. So now, time to introduce our three speakers today, who will be guiding us through perspectives that have made up this chapter, beginning with Professor Vishwa Sadka, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of the Witwatersrand. He is the editor of the Democratic Marxism series and the principal investigator for the Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene. He is a veteran activist and democratic eco-socialist, and his recent book is titled A Love Letter to the Many, Arguments for a Transformative Left Politics in South Africa, which was published by Chicana Media in 2024. Our second speaker is Professor Dr. Ruth Castell Branco, who is a senior researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, where she's the lead of the Future of Work Workers Research Program. And we're also joined by Dr. Michael Quitt, postdoctoral research fellow of the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg, and is a visiting fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. He is the editor of the Cambridge Handbook of Race and Surveillance, published in 2023, and he hosts the Tech Empire podcast and is the founder of the forthcoming website, peoplestech.org. Thank you, speakers, for joining us today, and we'll begin with our first speaker, Professor Vishwa Sadka.
Thank you, Awante, and good afternoon to all participants, including the AI note takers. So volume 8 of the Democratic Marxism series has been an exciting 2-year journey to bring together sort of reflexive Marxists and decolonial Marxist thinkers to dialogue with other critical anti-capitalist currents of thought. This series recognizes that Marxism is not hegemonic, but to amplify critical thought, it has to engage in dialogue with other currents. So in this volume, we kind of deploy all of this to kind of think about this big digital shift taking place in our society and being driven by big digital monopoly capital. Huge amounts of investments driving this shift, staggering amounts of capital. We put this volume together for 3 reasons. The first is that South Africa, like many countries in the world, have embraced this 4th industrial revolution shift, but without any serious and critical deliberation. It's almost like a foregone conclusion in our public discourse. It's a fait accompli, it's naturalized, and it's here. And we felt that we needed to position critical social science and critical perspectives against this, and to ensure that we think more deeply beyond the shallow futurism and blind embrace of this 4IR shift that's underway. The second reason for this volume was to challenge classical Marxism's productivist embrace of technology. Now, there are 2 theses in Marxism about technology. The first is technology is part of the forces of production, and you've got to just unleash this, and it'll lead growth, development, and progress. The second thesis is that as long as you have rational control of technology, this is a sufficient condition for a socialist. It's one of the necessary conditions for a socialist transition. But drawing on Walter Benjamin and premised in techno-realism, this volume questions digital technology itself. We ask questions about its ethics, about its risks, and about its consequences. This is not anti-technology, but rather is a position that is pushing us beyond the cult of technology, which has been central to capitalist modernity. The third reason for putting this volume together is that, unlike most Marxist analyses that are focused on the labor process and value extraction, including the famous Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek Marxist political economist, who's given us a very novel understanding of what he calls techno-feudalism. He gives us a class map of what he calls cloud capital and cloud fiefs and the cloud proletariat. But what Varoufakis doesn't do, he doesn't think about the implications of this for society. And this is kind of where we go with this volume. In this volume, we critically assess the class project of digital monopoly capital. We look at its technotopian ideology, we look at its class interests, and we look at its power relations. And again, in a wider frame, not just in terms of its deep accumulation processes. Now, what is technotopia, this kind of imaginary of digital monopoly capital? In this volume, we define technotopia around 3 dimensions. The first is that it's about futuring society. And if you kind of read the kind of stuff that's coming out of Silicon Valley, and whether it's the big corporations, Google and so on, they're leading intellectuals, etc., they want us to believe that we are on the cusp of a grand social transformative process in which the human is about to become the transhuman. In other words, there's some kind of merging of this digital technology and so on that awaits us. Everything from digital implants to kind of thinking even about transcending our species and becoming cyborgs and so on. And essentially, at the heart of this transhumanist, futurist thinking is this idea of full mastery of the self and our life worlds. In a sense, it's post-relational. It's actually a totalitarian, and it wants to bring about this, I would think, a bifurcation in our species between those who kind of embrace this kind of techno-infrastructure and sphere and world. And by the way, about 3 billion people on our planet do not have computers to start with. So this is very much a project coming out of the centers of capitalism and affluent societies. So that's the first aspect of technotopian thinking. The second is techno-solutionism. And so there's this idea that computational reality is reality. And so, Elon Musk and Doge and, trying to restructure one of the most complex states we have in the world and just pulling together a group of geeks and nerds and sitting behind computer screens thinking that you can just fire people with emails and WhatsApps and so on. And that, this is computational power. This is instrumentarian power, as Shoshana Zuboff tells us. But this is the problem with this, because it doesn't understand the complexity of socio-ecological relations and the world that we inhabit. It's way more complex than a computational screen and a computational reality. It's way more complex than code, actually. So this is another aspect of technotopia. The third aspect of technotopia actually has got to do with underplaying the sort of dual use nature of these technologies. Okay, so in a 3D printer, yes, you can produce a very interesting manufacturing device, but you can also produce a weapon that can kill many people. You can do research with drones, but drones can also deliver a payload that will devastate and annihilate an entire village. So this duality of these technologies, these two sides of them, are never brought to the fore together. It's generally presented to us as what's good for society. And these downsides are underplayed or ignored. So that's technotopia. The volumes, this volume has 9 chapters in it. There are 3 thematics that organize the volume. The first thematic is around risks and limits and power. The third is around the labor process and power. And the third is around emancipatory futures beyond technotopia. And we critically engage technotopia, class and power relations of digital monopoly capital across the volume. Jane Duncan looks at how technotopia is very much part of this new surveillance security kind of infrastructure that's growing up very fast around us and in societies. She looks at mass digital surveillance through these technologies. Ujjwala Satguru highlights the limits of building literacy just through reliance on digital technologies. Konstantin Nana brings out the regulatory lag and challenge from an Africa-centered perspective. Vincent Siwawa looks at waste pickers and the vertical class power they face on digital platforms that organize recyclers. Alex Mashilo looks at robotisation in the context of workplace upgrading in car manufacturing plants and the challenges for union engagements with policy. Michelle Bowens and his collaborators from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation situate an alternative approach to the digital shift with commons economics. Ruth, Sapati, and Mike will speak to their chapters. I'll just conclude with 2 final points, Awande. Just highlighting a few things from my own chapter around the dangerous contradictions of digital capitalism. This chapter is organized around 7 theses around these dangerous contradictions, but very quickly to highlight 2 or 3 things. So with digital code and so on, there's always glitches, and in the literature, it's so whatever software runs your phone, runs your computer, runs your car these days, and so on, there's always a glitch in it. And basically, these glitches provide an entry point. They basically Trojan horses into your device, into your technologies, etc. And what's happened is a dark market has grown up around 0 days, and this has become weaponized. The American security state is the largest buyer of these 0 days and so on. The other just quick point to highlight is around the kind of sort of permanent warfare we could enter with these digital technologies. Roboticization of warfare means that there are no constraints on modern warfare, okay? And this is where cutting-edge military thinking is going. So sort of giving powers of life and death to everything from drones to tanks, to satellites, to roboticized soldiers, etc., etc. So this is also something problematized in this chapter. And finally, just to say that these technologies have very, very intensive carbon footprints. To run data centers, to run cloud computing, to run Bitcoin, etc., requires intense amounts of energy. They also require to kind of drive the kind of growth of these technologies across the planet. Scalability, you need massive extraction of resources, etc. So there are very, very serious limits around scalability, around resources, etc., facing this big techno shift in our societies. So that's my chapter. We conclude this volume with a call to break with reductionist and siloed approaches to thinking the risks of the digital shift. Instead, we recognize it has to be located in the converging polycrisis. It should be located as a result in the response, which should be a deep, just transition. This means as society, we must own the digital shift and its attendant problems. We must decide what to accept. We must decide what to reject through critical and democratic engagement. We must democratize these technologies. We must bring ethics of design, application, and use to the fore, and not the digital monopolies. I want to finally end with thanking all the contributors, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for making this publication open access, the Emancipatory Future Studies for supporting the workshop with contributors and writing retreats, the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center for helping organize a lot of the activities around this, and Wits University Press. This volume is dedicated to Eddie Webster, who co-authored his chapter with Ruth and Sepati. I'm not sure, this might have been his last written work, but we dedicate it to the Madala of South African sociology. The last volume in this series is going to be on rethinking the state, and we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vish. And my most humble apologies. I had neglected to introduce our fourth speaker, who is with us now, Seipati Mokema, who is an associate researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of the Witwatersrand. And Seipati works on the future of work, workers, and intersectionality research streams. I would now like to introduce our next speakers, Ruth Castel Branco and Seipati.
Thanks so much, Awande, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this book. The Democratic Marxism series has just been such a wonderful resource, and I think we're all really happy to have been able to contribute to it. This chapter, as was mentioned, was written with Seipati, who is now at the International Water Management Institute, and the late Eddie Webster, when we were all here at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. It's called The End of Labor, Algorithmic Management and Emerging Forms of Worker Struggle on Digital Platforms. It starts 5 years ago, almost, when Uber Eats riders in Johannesburg collectively logged off the app, successfully paralyzing food delivery in the city for 2 days. Their demands included a minimum delivery fee and boost during peak hours, access to free occupational health and safety equipment, due process when contesting the flagging or blocking of riders' accounts, and the reopening of the company's physical offices to ensure better support services. In an interview, they said, "The strike is to prove that driver partners are paramount to Uber Eats' success in South Africa and around the world." They had this idea of themselves as part of a broader global movement fighting against these companies. That same year in Colombia, Rappi workers, another delivery company, joined the Movimiento Nacional de Repartidores de Plataformas Digitales and founded the trade union UNIDAP, which operates via an app. With support from the Colombian Central Federation of Workers, they coordinated strike actions across Latin America, including Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, where Rappi also operates. Over the past decade, then, we've seen this massive growth of digital labor platforms, which have been enabled by new and relatively cheap technologies. But the rise in platform worker protests also points to the ways in which working classes are reorganizing and challenges the prevailing view, that is our argument, that organized labor has become an irrelevant force for social transformation. Though we leave open the possibility for discussion of what kinds of labor constellations these may include. While trade unions have certainly taken a hit, and we've seen a decline in the labor density across the globe, including the African continent, contemporary proponents of post-work politics like Srinivas and Williams and others, have adopted what we see as a technologically deterministic position, which overlooks the struggles that are taking place over the terms of production and distribution. As Beverly Silver argues, while technological innovation can certainly weaken the bargaining force of one group of workers, it can strengthen the bargaining force of another. And in fact, we've seen across history the ways in which working class formations have been continuously made, unmade, and remade. So this paper or this chapter is particularly interested in the transformative possibilities, but also potential limitations of emerging forms of worker organization among workers on digital labor platforms. The chapter draws on interdisciplinary research that took place here at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, and it centers on 4 case studies from across the globe. Click farms in Brazil, e-commerce platforms, the Mercado Libre in Argentina, the delivery company Rappi in Colombia, agritechs in Ghana, and obviously delivery platforms here in South Africa. And in doing so, it explores how digital labor platforms have both restructured the labor process, focusing on conditions which Sepati will speak to, but also analyzes the transformative possibilities of emerging forms of worker power. And we've seen, of course, what a difference trade union organization and alliances can make in terms of giving these incipient movement some kind of space for mobilization, expansion, and really claiming back some concessions from capital. It analyzes then the transformative possibilities through the power resources approach, which Professor Eddie Webster would always argue was less a sort of blueprint to apply and rather a heuristic tool that was particularly useful in engaging workers and workers' organizations in thinking about where the sources of power may lie. The paper argues that the very processes which exacerbated the conditions of exploitation are also ones that open the spaces for resistance. And so while there has been a decline in traditional trade unionism, worker organizing is very much alive. But of course, resistance doesn't always fit neatly into traditional conceptions of what working class struggles should look like. And therefore, it's important to think about, well, what is actually taking place? And what are the relationships, alliances, tensions, and rejections between the emerging worker movements in the platform economy and established trade unions? Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Sepati, who's going to have the difficult work of trying to summarize the various aspects in the remaining.
Right. Thank you for that intro, Ruth, and also thank you to the organizers. Yeah, it's been really fascinating working on this research and writing the book chapter. So what I will do is sort of like I will speak on the part of the chapter that is related to how digital labor platforms have restructured the labor process and the associated conditions of work through algorithmic management. As Ruth has pointed out earlier, that our research is based on case studies, and we did this in collaboration with researchers across the global south in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Ghana, India, amongst many others. So, firstly, I will highlight some six aspects of the challenging conditions that digital platform workers with. And secondly, I will sort of like give a brief analysis of emerging forms of work organizing and the role that trade unions have played, using two examples of trade unions in Kenya and Uganda. So, moving on to the conditions of digital platform workers, the first one would be worker misclassification. The issue here is that workers are classified as self-employed. They do not, however, own the means of production, and they're economically dependent on the app for survival. They have little or no autonomy over their labor due to algorithmic management, and this has been a source of discussion, debate, deliberation with regards to the classification of the workers on digital labor platforms. The second one would be algorithmic management. This entails the use of algorithms to assign tasks, to track the performance of workers, to determine the pay, and to determine the employment, to terminate employment without any legal processes being adhered to. And this would normally be based on the customer's rating of the worker on the digital platform. Algorithmic management is also is also used to impose high levels of surveillance, and is also used to punish workers who, try to attempt to control their own time, to control their own working locations, and also to determine the amount of work that they can get done. So algorithmic management has been a negative force in this regard because it has transformed work processes into micro tasks, and this has resulted in worker skills being eroded, and also furthermore undermining the workers' bargaining power. The third aspect would be the workers' income and wages. We have noticed that workers normally receive below the living wage payment. So this is because of the case of workers being misclassified as self-employed, meaning that they do not have access to a guaranteed income at the end of the week or at the end of the month. Workers are generally paid per task completed instead of like the total amount of time spent on the actual work. Their paying rates are also often set by algorithms, and once the locker is locked off, they cannot receive any more work, and therefore they do not receive any more income. So because workers are classified as self-employed, they also have now to absorb the full operational costs. So this would mean that they have to pay for their own assets like a mobile device, a motorbike, a car, or they have to pay for their own insurance, they have to pay for their own petrol, they have to purchase their own health and social protection coverage. And this means that they're now on further a back foot when it comes to like receiving a full income that they can, take away. And then the fourth aspect would be long working hours. And this is really tied to the amount of the low income that the workers receive. Platform workers are often forced to work long hours to try to make ends meet. Fikile Masikane and Eddie Webster made a study, and they found that 80% of workers worked more than 56 hours a week on digital platforms. And this is the maximum, this is like way past the maximum working time that is set by the South African Basic Conditions of Employment Act. And then the fifth aspect would be occupational health and safety, also related to long working hours. Because digital platform workers have long working hours, they have negative implications for the workers' occupational health and safety. Platform workers regularly report incidents on the roads. They get robbed. They're also often harassed by the police. So again, because of the argument of that they are not employed, they are self-employed, they do not have access to social and labor protections, they do not have medical aid, they're not even compensated for workplace incidences and social security. And then the sixth aspect would be the right to freedom of association. So because they are not recognized as workers, they do not benefit from the right to freedom of association, collective bargaining, and due processes that is often afforded to unionized employees. So given these six above given challenges and aspects, we have looked at the role of worker organizing and trade union and what roles have come up in this respect. And we found that even though trade unions are present, their role has been slowly diminishing because workers in the digital labor platforms have sort of like used hybrid forms of organizing. This would include welfare groups, this would include cooperatives, this would include worker associations. But even though the role of trade unions are diminishing, they are not redundant per se in this respect. So through internal restructuring and new organizing strategies, trade unions can meet the needs of workers in the digital economy by providing critical support and access to institutional power and emerging organization for precarious workers. This is now where I make the example of two trade unions who took it upon themselves to sort of like adapt their strategies to adhere to the needs of digital platform workers. The first example would be the Transport and Allied Workers Union in Kenya. So in 2018, after Uber the Uber business model disrupted traditional taxi labor market in Kenya, the trade union began to organize drivers in the platform economy, and they have since managed to recruit over 2,000 drivers across Nairobi, Mombasa, Nakuru, Kimiso, and all extending all the way to Mount Kenya. So what they did is that they innovated an approach to develop a software product that allows them to receive in real-time messages that they receive payments from union members. This comes as a response to platform workers' reluctance to pay union dues, and to also extend to the union and also to extend their support to providing institutional support so as to provide appropriate assistance to platform-specific challenges. The second example would be a trade union in Uganda. It's called Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union. They also organize large numbers of informal taxi drivers and motorcycles by affiliating the already existing informal associations. So the union adopted digital tools to provide services to and empower their new members and challenge the exploitation through multinational platform companies. So Amalgamated also went a step further by developing two apps. The first app is a members-only map app, whereby digital platform workers affiliated and paying to the trade union are being served, and the app, not the app, through the app, the trade union serves is serving members and facilitating the collection of union dues for informal workers, managing the membership and the database of the collective, and also exchange of information among members. The union also is sort of like in this way trying to solve the issue of work organizing by building digital platforms to build a membership database through the phone applications. So just to round it up, what we learned in writing this paper, we learned that even though work on digitalization presents platform workers with numerous working conditions that serve as challenges, the same digitalization can be used to better organize and provide support to digital platform workers, which is a lesson best displayed by trade unions in Kenya and Uganda. And I will stop it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Sepati. I would now like to move to our next speaker, Dr. Michael Quitt.
Hi. Okay, so my chapter in the volume is called Digital Degrowth as Decolonization. And to unpack that, I'd like to use my time here to speak about digital degrowth, which is a big picture analysis of how to think about the digital economies. So I came out with a book called Digital Degrowth: Technology in the Age of Survival last year, August. And I go through it there. And so here I'll just speak to the big picture and then maybe talk just very briefly about how we can move from the macro to what's going on the ground. So for this, I want to just start with the question of what degrowth is, because I know that a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with it. And that happens to be the case even in the university, let alone the general public. Case in point, I've asked some pretty prominent scholars here at UJ, are you familiar with what degrowth is? And the answer was no. And as far as I'm concerned, this is one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue, perhaps alongside the invention of nuclear bombs that has ever existed in our species. So to not be familiar with that is goes to show how deep in a problem that we face right now. So if you're to look at the concept of degrowth, basically it's trended upwards recently as our environmental crisis has really intensified. And it started off from a scientific standpoint or in the 1970s with the publication of a report called The Limits to Growth. And while some of the speculations in that publication didn't turn out as we would expect, as time marched on, more and more science has come in to show that humans right now have reached the point where we're over extracting resources collectively in total as a species. So if we're to look at what we're using, we're basically consuming about 100 billion tons of material resources. Those are all of the raw materials that we make our economies out of. And the sustainable limit is thought to be somewhere around half that. If you look at the materials flows science, in 2023, there was a journal article that was published that interviewed and surveyed about 800 climate scientists and policymakers, and 73% said that they do not believe that environmental sustainability is compatible with continued growth. So while I can't go through the debate on the literature, I do urge people to consult the literature on the numbers and the science backing it. So if we look at it from the perspective of, are we using too much material resources? We have to look at also how that's divided up. So on a per capita basis in the high income countries, there's something over 26 tons per person per year consumed. In the low income countries, it's about 2. And the sustainable limit is thought to be somewhere around 6 to 8 tons of material resources per person per year. And on top of that, the high income countries rely on 9.8 metric tons of primary materials extracted elsewhere in the world. That's from a United Nations report that I believe was 2019, Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at also the issue of growth, we have to take into account compound growth, meaning exponential growth. And at a rate of 3% global growth in the economy, that's a doubling of the size of the economy when dollars, then we're now speaking of about $20,000 per head, right? So if we're to divide that up equally, but then also to reduce down the size of the global economy, and for South African audiences, $20,000 would be about 350,000 rands. We're looking at a situation where it's not even clear if we can eke out a middle-class existence for all the humans on the planet, a westernized middle-class standard of living. So if we're to look at things in the context of this, I just want to add one more thing on here, is that there's a biodiversity crisis, and then there's the climate crisis. And as far as the climate crisis goes, the goal has been to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level on average over a number of years. And we're very close to that threshold. We have exceeded 1.5, but it was in an El Nino year. And at that point, we go from possible to likely triggering major tipping points where things like say, turning the Amazon rainforest into a dry savanna, slowing down the ocean currents running under the Atlantic Ocean, and so on, start to occur and feed off of each other. So we really, really, really don't want to do that. And if you look at the models, barring the invention of and scaling up of technologies that are supposed to come around and save the day, like carbon capture and direct capture, et cetera, for which there's no evidence that is feasible in the time frame that we're looking. We're on pace to get up to about 2 degrees Celsius by the late 2050s, early 2060s. So that gives us basically a single generation not to do that. And at the pace we're going, if we continue to grow the global economy, then we're basically very likely to trigger those tipping points and to create a permanent catastrophe that we're not going to be able to get out of. Okay, so we really don't want to do that. And to what is called a low risk scenario is basically slashing the global economy in half. Just transition would require basically global class abolition, which would really mean no more rich and poor. South Africa, of course, is the land of Mercedes and shacks. That's got to go away basically within a single generation. So now, if we're to then say, well, what does the digital economy have to do with this? Well, we can talk a little bit about, and I'll return to very briefly, the issue of data centers and energy and water consumption, AI, and so on. But actually, if you look closely at the data, it's been overstated. So first and foremost, the issue we have with the digital economy is that by many measures, it's the most lucrative part of the global economy, and it's basically locked up by the United States. So in the Digital Degrowth book, I tabulated up the top almost 1,000 corporations, technology corporations. And if you look at it, it's pretty crazy. The United States has 519, 55%. It has about 77% of the market cap and about 59% of the revenue. By contrast, China has 6.3% of the companies, 5.7% of the market cap, and 11% of the revenues. And remember, China has 1.4 billion people, whereas the United States has something like, what, I think it's 340 million now. So if you also look at the US, it has about a third of the world's wealth. It has 45% of the financial assets. And so a minority within the United States is basically dominating that wealth. And it's at this point in history, no thanks in part to the dominance of its technology corporations. And so there you have an ecologically unequal exchange that is really at this point being spearheaded by this digital economy. Now, if we're then to look further, I do want to just touch upon very briefly the issue of AI and the data centers. So this is actually in my chapter. I ran the numbers, and keep in mind when I was writing the book on tech and the environment, I read the original reports and what I was looking at. And so I sat down and went through the peer-reviewed literature, the reports that the McKinsey reports, Goldman Sachs, IEA, et cetera. And when I ran the numbers, this is what it said. Basically, AI uses about 20% of data center capacity. And there's also, I should add, some numbers I've seen as low as 14%. So it may contribute about as little as 2.5% of greenhouse gas emissions within the ICT sector itself, or 0.035% of global emissions, and 4.9% of the ICT sector electricity use. So even if we look at the high-end projections, the electricity consumption on aggregate is actually very small on a global scale. And obviously you have the fossil fuel industry, which is a major contributor. You have manufacturing and industry, and we have the food system, right? Industrial agriculture, which are by far, the greater contributor to climate change. And so if we're looking at the issue of overheating the planet, if it does happen, I think it probably will at some point, not to be a pessimist about it, but we won't be looking back at this and saying, oh my God, we built those AI centers. That said, and the same thing is the case with water use. There are definitely some places, and it's generally localized in Ireland. It's at the national level because they're hosting a lot of data centers. But the environmental impact of data centers and AI. Remember, within data centers, AI is only a fraction of what they're being used for. I mean, they use it for hosting and transmitting all sorts of data. If we look at the data centers, it's not going to be, if we overheat the planet, it's not going to be because of AI, and it's not going to be because of data centers. But they do ecological and environmental destruction and so on, especially at the local level. So basically, the point about this is that if you're looking at the dominant narrative in the conversation on what's called the left in digital studies, it's basically dominated by the Zuboffs and by the Lena Khans and the Tim Wus and so on and so forth. It's a US Eurocentric worldview. They don't want to talk about digital colonialism. They don't want to talk about the digital economy as an American empire project. And as somebody who grew up in the United States, I understand the pressures of our ultra patriotism, which is around us, right? So the people who float to the top, the Zuboffs of the world, they're kind of careerist opportunists who never even took the time to even tabulate the data. It's that bad. And so really, we find ourselves oftentimes in a conversation where the general perspective, framework, and talking points, agenda items have already been cut out for us by this elite Western academia slash, mainstream media organizations slash rich nonprofits and so on. And they have decentered or erased entirely the American Empire project. So just to wrap up here, I want to connect this, like I said, I would at the beginning, to something like workers' movements in the transport industry. If you look at something like your Uber Eats, and so on, there is a question, and you want to bring in the socio-ecological justice issue. There's a question as to whether or not these companies should even exist. I'm not even speaking of simply not that the fact that they've privatized and operated as capitalists and concentrate the resources into the hands of the rich executives and investors. But I'm also speaking to the ecological context of automobile transport, right? I mean, we know here in South Africa that the transport industry between the taxi drivers and the Uber and Bolt drivers is a very kind of violent and territorial situation. But really, what we should probably be doing is developing proper public transport. And when you add on top of that the fact that these workers, say Uber and Bolt workers, are making so little for what they do, if they did have to be fairly compensated, there's an open question as to where we would even be in terms of the affordability. This idea that you have a private chauffeur at your fingertips on the cheap, with 2 minutes away at all points in time for any kind of somewhat densely populated area. So in other words, this digital degrowth, the socio-ecological context, has to be accounted for. And as far as workers go, I don't know if the environment is even in the conversation. But just to end here, if you look at this situation, we have a single generation to pull this off. And right now, it's not looking good. And if we do indeed need a degrowth situation to emerge, and there is to be socio-ecological justice, that basically means abolishing class. And that kind of thing cannot happen without, it's not going to happen over a cup of tea. It's going to require a retooling of society And those who are rich and wealthy and in control of the means of production will pull out everything they have in their toolkit to suppress it. So it's not pretty times ahead.
I'd like to thank all three of our speakers for those really incisive inputs. It's also a very timely opportunity for us to be launching this 8th volume, given what's happening currently in the geopolitical scale, but also the kind of mainstream rise and appreciation of how tech has also played a role in the shifting ways in which power is organized, particularly within the context of the US, with the central role of the oligarchy in the current administration. I'd also like to let everyone know that we'll be sharing the links to our previous volumes as Professor Satka had gone through within his first presentation with some of the other volumes available, but they range from BRICS and New American Imperialism, Marxism in the 21st Century being the first one, and also the climate crisis in the South African and global democratic eco-socialist alternatives being among some of the other volumes available. So please do share these widely and freely. Feel free to do so, as this is part of building the emancipatory knowledge commons. So at this point, I would like to welcome all our speakers back to the platform as we engage in some questions and answers and discussion from the audience. So if you are in attendance, please, if you have any questions, place them into the chat. And also, if you have any other statements for the speakers, do feel free to place those into the chat. So just surveying some of the inputs that we have so far as audience members gather their thoughts and pose these questions, I'll just like to just give some attention to some of the inputs that I see here in the chat. One of them being that, for your interest, some recent news from Kenya and the TAWU and its affiliates, which is a link regarding the border drivers and the delivery associates in Kenya. So I think that also speaks to some of the issues that were touched on by our second speakers, Dr. Castel Branco and Sebati Mokema, with regards to digital platforms and the ways in which they're shaping labor. But just as a way of using my speaker privileges, I'll pose the first question to our panelists here, in that, given the moment that we're currently in, with regards to the scale at which tech, digital tech, but tech in general in broad terms, has kind of taken a central role in reconfiguring how capitalism is shaped, but also how power is wielded across the globe. What space do you see for us as little corners of the global South in being able to chart an alternative? How do we put forward an agenda that the world can take forward as a way for us to steer us away from this current moment? I think Michael's presentation on digital capitalism kind of put it front and center, in the sense of tech as we've experienced it has become a project of American imperialism, but you also have the rise of China being something that is now counterbalancing that. So I'd just like to pose this question as a way to begin, and I think it also probably touches on what this volume is also bringing forward. But I'd like to pose that question to our speakers, beginning with you, Vish, and then going forward with the other speakers in that order.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the limits that digital monopoly capital faces is the kind of geopolitical rivalries you're talking about. And, you know, what China did with its kind of AI thing has kind of completely disrupted the kind of financial inflow into this whole thing. I think, what was it called? DeepSeek, I think. I mean, the way they've handled open access and other things, and kind of allowed for collaborative relationships. I mean, there's a lot of questions about how much of upfront capital the Chinese state put into this thing. But anyway, that's one thing that's going on, and it's going to play itself out, and it will create space. I think the other thing is what I was alluding to as well, and that is that, you know, beyond the hype, the lived reality of these technologies is that they're not perfect. As I mentioned, you know, the 0 days and the glitches in the software, etc. I mean, one of the biggest challenges for the purveyors of this technology is keeping up with cyber crime. This thing is constantly spiking. The moment you kind of close the gap, crime finds a way in, etc. It's very, very serious, by the way. It's built into corporate capitalism today to have experts on security and so on. And so again, there's a societal backlash that's going to come through along the way, where people are going to feel the kind of limits of this technology in everyday life. And I think that also opens up space for kind of conversation and so on. I think the other point is the climate issue. I hear what Mike was saying about AI, and I agree with what he's saying about carbon emissions. But if you aggregate it more broadly, which is what I'm talking about, yes, the computing centers, yes, the Bitcoin and so on and so on. I mean, the big push in the US right now from digital monopoly tech is for nuclear power, because they know they need more power for scalability, okay? And nuclear comes with a whole host of challenges to our societies ecologically and so on. So again, you know, the kind of trade-offs that have to happen actually with carbon emissions and the just transition, that's also going to open up opportunities. And finally, you know, some of us have been speaking about extractivism and resources. I have, Mike has, and so on. They are objective limits to resources. And so, you know, are we going to have digital electronic vehicles on our roads? Or are we going to have clean energy public transport on our roads? Okay. I think this is where hard choices are going to have to be made by societies. So that's going to open space. It's not going to be, in my view, just an easy walk for digital tech, despite the kind of ideological and political convergences, whether it's in China, by the way, and its own version of a kind of totalitarian world, whether it's even in the US. I think that all these contradictions are going to open up space.
Ruth Sepati?
Thanks. Sabati, maybe I can start and then I'll turn it over to you. Second. Cool. I mean, I think that what we've seen in the platform economy is that the platformization of work has concentrated capital across sectors and geographies. And as these platforms grow, they also diversify into new areas. And I think that is a real challenge. But in our case, labor is still essential to the process of value production, right? And sometimes if you're looking at online-based platforms, that labor is hidden. If you're looking at location-based platforms, you can actually see labor, right, as intermediaries. And so the question then becomes, I think, to Dinga's question in the chat is, to what extent have these emerging forms of organization that arise because there's a gap, because trade unions are not organizing, there's a representation gap, to what extent have they been sustainable? And I think that is a really important question, and much of the evidence suggests that they've been most sustainable when there's some kind of connection to established trade unions, because established trade unions have some level of political power. They have resources to sustain and cross-subsidize organizing. They're part of global labor unions that can also bring some level of support and resources to local organizing drives. And that it's very difficult to have sort of emerging forms of organization that stand entirely on their own, you know. And I think that this goes beyond sort of organizing in the platform economy to look at the rise of worker centers, et cetera, and various forms of experimentation, that there's been this kind of struggle around sustainability. The problem being that many trade unions are absolutely resistant to organizing these sectors. So, and part of it has to do with, concerns over resources. What is the membership base? How are they going to collect dues? We have a article that Eddie and someone actually from the Transport Workers Union, Bill Mutoro, and I wrote on just the tensions that exist when unions start to try to reorient to organize workers in the platform economy. But for those who have been able to successfully do so, and I think the best example of that is Latin America and is with the Rappi workers, they've actually been able to then wage a transnational struggle against these transnational companies and to successfully be able to get something out of that process. Of course, to Mike's point, right at the end, Michael Quet's point, there is a question about, what if we think these are the strategic sort of base of organizing for the future, this is where the working classes will be remade. To what extent are these even desirable industries, right? Environmentally, is this sustainable? Is the Uber model sustainable economically and socially? I think what we're also seeing is a kind of marriage now between the sort of big tech and the fintech. So in order to be able to sustain adverse forms of incorporation, and maintain the business model of what we see as delivery and ride hailing, you then have the entry of fintechs that are sort of bringing in financing for workers to be able to absorb these costs, but that ultimately end up trapping them in relations of credit and debt that undermine the possibilities for claim making. But I'll turn it over to Sipati.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I was my thinking is also along, the same trajectory. When Awanda asked the question, the first thing that came to my mind is the best way to respond is through the power of the collective. Just thinking back what we saw, like the mere act of forming an informal cooperative or a society, as we call them in South Africa, that in itself is sort of like a response, a pushback to the demands of digital capitalism and technologies. So I think it's really up to us as Southerners, I will put it like that, as Southerners, to choose how we respond, and to the extent that we want to use and engage with these platforms. But it's always best done so as as collective bodies, because one cannot wage a war against an entire global institute. So collectives, for me, collectives are the way to go.
Quickly, before I bring in Michael here, there is a question from Mashia Shir around trade unions. And given the responses we just got, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to maybe think if you'd like to reform that question or pose it again, because I think it was to both you, Ruth and Sipati. But Michael, you may go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so in terms of change, I don't know. I mean, it's obviously for all of us very frustrating to live in this world that we have here, and it's hard to know exactly what to do. Now, if we're to take the approach that as I understand it, of the Democratic Marxism series, that equality is not just something that is pertaining to class and economics, but it's also to politics, right? So really, I think we would all agree we'd like to see full political, economic, and social equality. And I very much look forward to the forthcoming volume on the state, because really, if you think about it, the state is kind of a minority that imposes itself in terms of rulemaking and administration of those rules on society. And a more democratic world would have lifelong education and participation in the society from the mass majority. Maybe not every single person, but I think it would be a different way of life. And so if you look at what's been tabled as what to do about big tech, most of it has come out of elite academia. So how do they handle political economy? They say, oh, we need antitrust. And if you look at the roots of antitrust, it came out, I mean, it has roots going further back than, but modern antitrust goes back to the late 19th century, and it was created by a bunch of white male elites, especially in the United States with the Sherman Act. And if you look closely into their politics, it's pretty grotesque. But really the objective of antitrust is to create this mythological fair and competitive capitalism. And on top of that, if you look at it, there was a study that came out a couple years back, 2-3 years back, by two scholars that went through the empirical record in the United States. It's the most comprehensive review of the literature on industry concentration in the United States. And across every single decade, they went back to about 1917, and that's where they got their data from. And then they're trying to reconstruct more data going further back because their methodology and what data was available before them was kind of impoverished. But over a 100-year period, industry concentration went up. It didn't matter if it was progressive, liberal, or neoliberal/conservative antitrust. Industry concentration went up. So it's kind of like saying, imagine a policy was in place to decarbonize the environment, the atmosphere, and over the, let's say, carbon capture or cap and trade, et cetera. And over a 100-year period, the carbon emissions went up, right? You would say this is a failed policy. And so we're in this situation now where, unfortunately, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but the time for these tweaking at the edges reforms is over. And so now you have to ask yourself the question, well, how can a transformation occur? And to me, I want to go back to what Ruth was saying. I think the unions are a place. I think we need to be pushing for education in the workplace, paid education, maybe workers get an hour a day as part of their labor to have a democratic session about what's going on locally, what's going on in the world. We need to have education there and also in the schools. We learn junk in schools. We don't know basic facts. So the thing is, you can't resist something if you don't understand it, or if you have such a partial understanding of it, that it doesn't fit into the bigger picture. So I don't know the answer to it, but to me, change from above, including from the intellectuals, versus change from the broad base of society. But the challenge is go to Pick and Pay, walk down the street. How many people are having these conversations? It's frustrating, but I think unless we can find a way to get the mass majority involved and in this conversation, our chances of a good transition and change in society are slim. So I don't know.
I think Michael gave us a great point, which kind of bridges on to one of our first questions in the chat. Given some of the critiques that you're putting forward with regards to where ideas come to challenge the state of things, I think also if any of you have been following this with regards to some of what Michael was saying, some of the mainstream points with regards to dealing with this concentration have been around Lina Khan, the former FTC chair in the United States, and that given more time and the work that she was doing, maybe that was a way to bridge that. But given some of Michael's critiques, I think it also helps expand our thinking around what is more necessary to be able to deal with the strength, concentration, and power of these industries. Which then brings me to the first question in the chat from Sunil Mahabir, who says, what are the implications for the digital economy for the public service within our country, especially within labor-intensive sectors like education and health? So I think that's kind of a nice bridge from what Michael is saying to also now kind of bring it back to, in the South African sense, how do we deal with that at the level of the state? So I'd like to pose this question actually to Ruth and Sepati, and then Vish, if you have anything you'd like to add, or Michael, then you can come in.
It's interesting. There's some research actually that's been done by Bridget Kenny and others that's looking at how algorithmic management in the platform economy has now been extended to other sectors, right? Health, logistics, and so on. And one of the things that we've seen with the way that sort of states have embarked on the modernization project is that it's been very much aligned with the privatization project. There's this idea, and we saw the best example of this actually was the outsourcing of social grants to Net One CPS, right? This idea that the state has lost the capacity to be able to innovate technologically, and therefore that any kind of modernization has to happen through privatization and outsourcing, which in the case of social grants is then tied also to the financialization of social welfare. And I think that there has to be, we've seen that also, this is an idea that the World Bank has promoted across the African continent. We've seen it, for instance, in Mozambique, similarly, even in contexts where the kinds of strategies that they're putting forward are ones that are ill developed for the context, right? But it's not actually, in many cases, the sort of strategy around modernization of the public sector in the context of austerity has not been about expanding or improving the quality of services. It's actually modernization, digitalization being used as a tool of austerity. And what's interesting is that in many ways, what Elon Musk did with Doge in the US is precisely what the World Bank has been doing in developing countries across the African continent, using its control over digital systems, information management systems, et cetera, to impose their own policies that are sometimes they contravene the policies of the country. I've written something about that in relation to Mozambique and social grants. But just to say, obviously, digitalization and the modernization of public provisioning can be a good thing. But in the end, the terms reflect the class politics that are underlie, I guess, the terms of public provisioning in that moment. And I think that leads to Janet's point about getting to fully automated luxury communism. I mean, the one good thing about Musk is that it really showed that this idea of a benevolent tech entrepreneur that is somehow going to allow us all to live a life of luxury is a myth, right? And that we cannot escape class politics, and that means that we need to think about how it is that we build power. But I'll turn it over to Sebastian.
Oh no, that's fine with Fish.
So before I move on to the next question, which is back to Ruth and Sepati, I think Ruth's point's also quite timely given the introduction of Budget 3.0, and some of the conversations have been about how do we move forward from this impasse we'd had, and one of the conversations came around social grants and integrating that framework of digitizing and managing the flow of these grants, who deserves it, who doesn't, and that technology will be the answer. So I think that it's an ever increasingly relevant point in terms of how we think about the management of our state, but also how it also impacts the class divides and how we manage that in our country. So I think that was a really relevant point. And now coming to the next question to both of you from Dinga Sikwebu, who says, have the hybrid organizations that you studied been sustained, and were there any challenges?
Patty, do you want to take this one first? I'm always jumping. I mean, yes, to some extent. I think what we've seen is, for instance, the Divas Association, an association of women drivers in Nairobi, that joined the Transport Workers Union, right? But still maintain some level of autonomy. And some of those workers are also part of SACCOs, saving and trading cooperatives, and in which they buy a share in some other kind of income generating activity that will hopefully generate revenue into the future. And they're also part of welfare groups and mutual aid associations. So, workers have multiple places and connections and identities. But where organizing has been able to get the kind of traction to fight against transnational, multinational corporations that are increasingly footloose has been where they're globally networked. And I think the example of the struggles of Rappi workers in Latin America is a case in point. But there has also been sort of proactive attempts, the Transport Workers Union also in Nigeria, et cetera. The question is, of course, where you have established transport unions, will they be able to restructure and respond to the needs of platform workers? And that hasn't always been the case, and so we've seen, for instance, in the case of Nigeria, there ultimately was a split and platform workers kind of went on their own. But the union for a moment was an important incubator that kind of moved them beyond association to a kind of broader level of action.
So our next question brings into focus a question with regard to labor and unions again, but I think it has a wider implication, and thus I'd like to begin by posing this question to Michael and then Vish, and then Rusepati, you may come in, obviously given the natural inclination of your work. But the question is, how can collective formations like unions and other associations combat the peculiar ideology of Silicon Valley? So much of the relational fabric of our culture has atrophied under neoliberalism, replaced by fanatical hyper-individualism, the compulsion to consume, grind, and personal brands and cyber-mediated connections, which has left a void where sources of genuine community and solidarity once thrived. How can labor be a tool not merely for specific work contestations, but innovate a renewed struggle, for want of a better term, a socialistic soul? So Michael, would you like to take that first, and then Vish, you may come in?
Well, I mean, it depends on what your objective is. If your objective is better wages, better working conditions, more safety, and those things are, of course, supportable and very understandable, but you're not going to get that far with these corporations owning the core stuff of the global digital ecosystem. Anytime you want to use a computer, whether it be your processor, doing a search, speaking with your friends, you basically have to go through their stuff. And if you have to go through their stuff, then they're getting a cut, and that's how they're getting so rich. So on the one hand, you can look at the kind of let's improve my personal life in the moment kind of struggles, which are valid. But if you want to undo the system of inequality and environmental destruction, you're going to have to change things at the root level. Now, my book chapter, I also did forget to mention, talks about something that I proposed in a few years back, which is a digital tech deal. I didn't call it a new deal because I didn't want it to be associated with FDR and capitalism. But the idea was that things tend to overlap and work in conjunction with each other. For example, you have intellectual property, and you also have ownership of the means of computation at the physical level. And these things tend to intersect, and it's hard to get rid of one without the other. So really what you need at that point is a multifaceted plan to reconstruct the digital economy. And I think that could also be pushed for with environmentalists. In there, I took cues from various radical environmentalist organizations to say, why don't we have something like this in the tech space, and then we can join hands with other movements to try to push the agenda through.
Vish, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, I think this question relates to Thabo Ntoni's 3 questions as well. I mean, is there a kind of theory of capitalism behind this particular volume? No, not systematically. I mean, for me, I mean, the kind of theory of capitalism we need today is what I would call a theory of ecocidal capitalism. And it's an ecocidal capitalism that has been made over 500 years. And, if we look at its background conditions that enable it to exist, I mean, here borrowing from Nancy Fraser, it's completely destroying all of that. And basically, this is the capitalism that is bringing to the fore, not necessarily the classical working class, but it's bringing to the fore what I would call forces of socio-ecological reproduction. And forces of socio-ecological reproduction embrace unions, they embrace workers, but they also embrace a wider field of political subjectivity in terms of our fault lines and our struggles today. So in responding to Nick, it's not just a question of trade unions shouldering the responsibility of socio-ecological reproduction. It's a wider array of social and political forces, which leads then into, in Thabo and Tony's questions. I mean, I think for me, these digital technologies, and particularly we're seeing now with these large language models and so on, that are being fed the kind of whole treasure trove of kind of human knowledge. Basically, again, they're stepping outside of, interestingly enough, private property, etc., and they're just stealing everything. And they're even extracting, again, indigenous knowledge. My colleagues at WITS, and I'm having conversations with those in the robotics department and somebody who's just set up an institute over lunch. I mean, it was all about, well, what can we extract from nature for these large language models and so on. So it's kind of a kind of coloniality, an epistemic coloniality that we have to kind of theorize, grapple with, and understand. And we haven't fully done that in this book. There are gestures to this kind of stuff. And then finally, I'll just say this about delinking. I think it's a juxtaposition, Janet, to the sort of trajectory towards fully automated communism. I mean, I think that's a very, very kind of structurally deterministic position, and a kind of Eurocentric Marxism that sees this as the universal future for all of us. Actually, Samir Amin's delinking is a much more decolonial perspective, and it recognizes the multilinearity of history. There are multiple trajectories. And I think it is very relevant for this conversation. It's relevant for how we in the global South, how we in Africa, in South Africa, think about where we want to go with our society. At the heart of delinking, not putting up walls, but it is having the political autonomy and sovereignty to determine your choices. And I think these are great questions, and I think they open up further debates and discussions. Thank you.
I think the point on delinking actually really does touch to some of the scale of what these problems require us to think of with regards to how do we navigate them. And I think about some of the points that Michael just brought in with regards to the previous question also makes us think about how do you repurpose these technologies as public utilities if we rely on them so much and they have socially beneficial aspects to them. But that also brings around, the question of these are platforms that are based in the global north, and what opportunities are there for agency from the global south to also repurpose them in that way. So I think it's great that all of these are coming to the fore. And I think in line with this, I'll just pose Jane Barrett's question to Michael with regards to contradiction between unsustainability of the platform-based transport and the urgent need for degrowth. And Jane is asking if, with an example of the International Transport Workers Federation and its work, if this would be a cop-out, a reformist cop-out in Michael's eyes. I don't know if Michael, you have any points for Jane with regards to this.
Yeah, just real quick on the delinking. There are some things that it's kind of hard to delink from, and I'm not an expert in Samir Amin's research, but I know that he was not in favor of autarky, meaning just run your own thing within a single country. But there are some things that now, if we're going to talk about these digital technologies and platforms, we have to start separating out the different things that are there because they're not all alike. So, for example, you can do something like ban Uber from your country pretty easily, and it's just a regulation. Whereas if you have something like an email service or a search engine or a chat platform, Now you're going to have to basically start policing the open borders of the internet. And the way to do that, you're starting to move yourself towards China's model, where you're spying on what everybody is doing so that you can determine what they're doing and what they're not allowed to access. So if you also look at the semiconductor industry, all right, it's a highly specialized industry. There's chemicals production, there's all sorts of sophisticated machines, and it's not so simple to, within your own country, say, hey, we're going to make advanced computer processors, and we're just going to take this all in within our own borders. And on top of that, you have the problem where some of this infrastructure, like the cloud data centers, are basically a form of debt. I mean, what do you do with the fact that Microsoft, Amazon, etc., are building these giant warehouses of server farms, and now they own that property, but they're here in Cape Town, they're here in Joburg, and so on. So the delinking issue is a really complex one, and it's not easy to figure out exactly how to do it. And I also just want to kind of really quickly on Vish's point about stealing the property of the knowledge. I definitely agree with the thrust of the argument. I'm sure Vish would agree that we'd like to see knowledge be open. If it wasn't being done by these profit-oriented privatizing parties, and it was agreed upon and humane, then we can actually ingest that information and use it for things like AI. So the question about the cop-out, I just want to bring it up here. You know, I'll return to that. I don't want to take up, like, speak too much here. I wanted to speak to those. If I'll type an answer in the things, if that's okay.
Okay, so we are now pressed for time. So I would just like to end off with one question for the entire panel. Can start with Michael, Ruth, and Sepati, and then Vish, you may close off. And I'll just kind of meld it in with Kwezi's question, Kwezi Mabasa's question, with regards to our conversations around digital work, being industrial in their setting or context, and how do we think around these questions of digital technologies, technology and the tech sector, and care economy or the care context. So I'd just like to pose that question to our panelists, Michael, Rutse Pati, and then Vish, you may round us off with your final closing inputs as well.
Okay, I mean, I don't have too much more to say, but I think that we have to see the big picture. And if we're looking from the environmental standpoint, I saw somewhere along the way, somebody said, you can't burn down the walls of your house to keep yourself warm. So we have constraints, and we have to live within those constraints first and foremost. And then we have to orient everything around those constraints. So I think if we're looking at the issue of the global digital economy, we have to emphasize as a starting point the big picture, which is class inequality, the dominance of the American empire, the obvious aspirations of China and their exploitation. I'm not a Chinese Communist Party sympathizer, but we have to start there. Within South Africa, it's, from what I've seen, there's a heavy attempt to reproduce the Silicon Valley blueprint so that these tech bros and so on can find a way to make money by copying what they see elsewhere. So we need a big picture vision, and then we need to try to find a way to integrate this into social movements and see if we can find a way to break through to the general public. It's a big challenge. It's not easy.
Ruth Sepati?
Sure, if I may go first, Ruth. Yeah, I actually wanted to respond to next question earlier on, and it's sort of like also my closing statement. Just wanted to say I personally beg to differ with the notion that the relational fabric of our culture has been atrophied under neoliberalism. I think during the entire neoliberal phase. That's why we saw the biggest upsurge of social movements who stood to, to stand up against capital, to push back against their demands, and to sort of like offer alternative debates or offer alternative and context-specific responses to capitalist ideologies. Whether you see these social movements, as like a group of women getting together to do their own thing despite of technological innovation, or whether you see these, social movements playing out online, bringing the debates online, on Twitter, on Facebook, and whatnot, and sort of like, getting a collective together to debate, to offer alternatives. So we do have options. It's not all doom and gloom, if I may say so, but there is definitely power in the collective. There is definitely power in the social movements. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sapanti. One of the questions to Kwezi's point directly, is that much of the narrative in the global north is that platformization has made conditions more precarious. But of course, we know that in the context of the African continent, there's already widespread informality and labor insecurity. What platforms like Sweep South offer, therefore, is the possibility to actually extend labor and social protections to groups of people who have been historically marginalized. It may be, for instance, that domestic workers already don't have access, for instance, to UIF, but a platform like Sweep South has the technical capacity to be able to facilitate access to those if it so chooses. Instead, platforms have skirted labor and social protections and regulations, partially because they've benefited from the fact that there wasn't kind of regulatory frameworks. But as Mike mentioned, in certain contexts, like Sweep South, in Kwezi's example, it is very possible to determine what the rules of the game actually are. I think the other thing that emerges is around the care economy is then, what are the implications of a potential reproductive squeeze? Because what we end up seeing is that platforms end up, through algorithmic management, actually taking activities that used to be informal, but where workers had some level of autonomy, and actually squeezing workers. And that then intensifies the burden of paid and unpaid labor. If we had states that socialized the cost of social reproduction, that would be a different sort of, that would offer something different. But instead, what we see, as we talked earlier, is that the socialization of care is actually undermined by digital technologies. And so none of this is predetermined. I think that's the lesson I would have out of this, is that these are all places where struggle is possible.
So just to add, I think this digital shift is meeting the fourth great crisis of capitalism, and it is a crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. And I think in this volume, I think we kind of highlighting how it's going to exacerbate this crisis of social reproduction and care in many, many ways. At the same time, I think there are some ways forward. There's a lovely chapter on commons economics, and I think participants and those who engage the book would find something very valuable there, because commons economics is about democratic control. It's about ethical values, and it's about trying to locate this shift there. And there's another concept, or rather an allied concept to this, that's kind of articulated in the conclusion, the deep just transition. So I think if we bring that together with kind of care economy ideas and so on, we have the makings of an exciting kind of response to digital capitalism. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'd like to extend a big thanks to our speakers. Just a reminder that this session and this launch will be uploaded on the COPAC YouTube and the Emancipatory Future Studies page for all those who have missed it and would like to share it as well. In addition to that, the links for all the previous volumes from 1 to this current volume that we're launching today, 8, have been shared in the chat. So please do go take a look at that and share widely to spread and expand this digital knowledge commons. With that, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Vishwa Satka, Sepati Mokema, Dr. Ruth Castel-Branco, and Dr. Michael Quit. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Please do share, engage with the volume, and expand this digital knowledge commons. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you, Wande. Good night,
Thanks.
everybody.
Dear colleagues, thank you, Awande.